For those people who have tuned in, thanks very much for joining us this morning in the latest installment of Impero Talks. I'm Corris from Impero, and taking you through today's presentation is our Chief Strategy Officer, Tyas. So this week we're focusing on DIY and home care category, and taking a closer look at how and why people's relationship with DIY and their homes is changing. So before I pass you over to Chris, let me just say thanks for sharing your key challenges when you registered. If we haven't touched on them in the presentation, then please don't hesitate to ask a question either in the chat or the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom window. And as we'll be taking questions at the end for a bit of a Q&A discussion. Or if what you've heard has resonated with some of the challenges and concerns that you have, and you'd like to explore some themes further, then we'd be happy to chat to you after this to discuss setting up a session or a workshop to do just that. So what I'm going to do now is I'll pass over to Chris and he'll take you through the presentation.
Thank you, Corris. Good morning, everyone. We've got a quite packed talk today. I think you guys are going to be really interesting. We're talking about future trends. We're talking about looking into the future and trying to make some hypothesis of what's going to happen. We sometimes talk about post-COVID. I guess we're not, what that really means, we're not sure. We don't have the answer to that, unfortunately, but I guess we mean post the big lockdown that we had and how that affected our lives, whether we have to continue to kind of live with COVID or vaccines and such like on the horizon. I guess we mean from this point forwards, the trends look like in the sector. I often would just refer to DIY in this chat just because it's a bit long to say DIY and home brands every time. So forgive me on that for the slight abbreviation, but I am inclusive of the of both the kind of opportunities. Now, a bit like COVID, when we look at trends, we don't have a crystal ball. It's hard to predict trends, but luckily for Impero, we've got a couple of tools that we use when we're solving clients' problems, whether that's a social media campaign or an ATL campaign, identifying a new consumer target, whatever that might be. We've got a couple of tricks up our sleeve, and we're going to show you what we've done with them today to dig into the trends. So there's two things that we like to do among many that we've got. The first is a trend prediction mapping tool. So what we do is study about 400,000 consumers across the world. And these are micro influencers. They tend to be on the cusp of being influenced by brands. They tend to be kind of early adopters and they tend to be a good indicator of what other consumers might follow if we believe that A, they're influential, and B, they tend to be moving ahead slightly faster than everyone else. What we do with them is we look at all the data that they're creating online, and then we use a predictive analytics model to score and work out the likelihood and the propensity for that trend to grow. So it's a reasonably accurate way of understanding a forecast of the future. We then combine that with consumer validation. This is really to understand the why behind the data. And so what we've been doing since lockdown is living with households over a number of weeks to really delve into their lives. And we've got to know these people quite well. So yeah, so we've been living with kind of consumers, and I guess it's as ethnographic research as we can do in this current time and get close to what's going on in their lives. Two key focuses today and hopefully some clear takeaways. What we want to understand is why people are doing so much DIY and home improvement. So not across the whole sector, but a number of brands that we've spoken to have experienced kind of record sales, booms in certain areas. And we just thought it'd be really interesting to understand why that's happening, and then look at some of the future trends that we could possibly consider using the prediction mapping tools and consumer validation that I just mentioned. So why are we doing so much DIY and home improvement? So there's a couple of pieces here that are really interesting. So what happened during lockdown is we couldn't spend our money that we'd otherwise earmarked for holidays or for treats. So the average UK homeowner, according to a report done for money.co.uk, spent £4,000 on home renovations during lockdown, which is obviously a considerable amount. And they also started to use their savings to finance home improvement. So there's a huge kind of uplift that many brands kind of experienced. Yes, UK homeowners, they spent £4,000 and they were using that to finance home improvements, and they were taking that money from holidays, and they were taking that money from savings. And a number of large brands kind of posted large increases in sales across the sector. Some of you may have experienced this, maybe some of you didn't. But one of the things that we found, and this is across all sectors, that a significant life change drives brand trial and switching. So this could be a new job, retiring, marriage, having kids. The research shows from 2016 that when you have a major life event, and we could argue COVID represents one of these types of life events, that we're more likely and more open to trying new brands. And we can see that in people's potential adoption of trying and considering DIY. And what we'd like to propose to you is this idea that COVID was a life event, and this one small change can trigger a chain reaction of consumption. And I want to kind of, rather than just say that I think that it's created a chain reaction and a trigger, I'm just going to use some psychology from, it's back in the 1700s. So this was a famous French philosopher at the time. He wrote the French version of an encyclopedia. He wasn't a wealthy man and lived around 1700. And as the story goes, his daughter was getting married. He couldn't afford to give her away and the gift that was required during that time. So someone came in and offered to buy his set of books, I guess the rights to those books, for £100, which in today's money would be about £50,000. And he felt pretty good and pretty excited to have all this money, and he'd given his daughter away to be married. So he decided to treat himself to a new robe. And I think the photograph there shows him in his new robe. Oh, there it is. There's this beautiful robe that he purchased with this new money as a treat for how well he'd done. And he ended up penning this kind of article that went on to trigger many other related sciences to write about this. And it was the title of this paper was "Regrets on Parting with My Old Dressing Gown." And it was a warning to those who have more taste than fortune. And what the article went on to say, and it was his experience really he was writing about, is the dressing gown that he purchased had started a chain reaction. It was so beautiful, when he looked round his room, he looked at the old rug and decided that didn't match his robe. He looked at the old clock and decided that wasn't good enough. So he slowly upgraded every single item in his home. And he looked at all these items and just thought there was no more coordination, there was no more unity, there was no more beauty. Previously, he'd been quite happy, but this trigger, this new robe, this one item had allowed him to perceive all of his other items to not be worthy. And this effect, the Diderot effect, as it was called, and still is, was based on two ideas, two principles. The first principle was the idea of a cohesive personality, to present ourselves to the world when we're past 10 or 15, or we get into our early 20s. What we need to do, we need to paint a picture of ourselves to the outside world. It's no longer good enough to just be a nice person. You have to present yourself. And to do that, we often buy possessions, we surround ourselves with things that create an identity. And the second principle that he identified, that was attaining a single new possession often creates a spiral of consumption, which leads you to acquire new things. And as a result of that, we just continually keep buying things that our previous selves would never have even considered or feel happy or fulfilled doing. And I think if we all just pause for a second, we can all kind of relate to that, whether it was, you bought a new pair of gym shoes, and then suddenly you looked at the gym bag that you were taking to the gym and thought, well, that looks a bit scrappy now for my nice new shoes. Or, suddenly, well, hold on a sec, maybe I need a new top as well, because that old top looks a bit rubbish against my new trainers. We can all relate to this idea of adding new things to fit in with the new surroundings. And you can see how important this would be for DIY brands to sort of understand this. What does this all mean? So a lot of you, because it makes sense, will understand that creating a vision, that personal identity that someone can reflect upon and say, yes, that's the sort of person I am, is a great way to merchandise, to bring together solutions in a coherent way. And a lot of brands do this. This is, I think, John Lewis, or it might be IKEA, I think, in fact. And what they do is they create a cohesive, uniformed idea of connecting parts, and almost as a design system. And this design system means that one thing nicely goes with another thing. And this works great, right? This is a really, really great strategy. And I would argue this works really well in times when people are buoyant, when there's an upswing in the market. Ideally, like we've maybe seen with people spending £4,000 on upgrading their homes during lockdown. I don't think it's necessarily a great strategy in times of recession or a slower recovery, you could argue, if that's what we're going into over the next couple of quarters. What I'd like to present as an idea is, if we're in for a tough economy, starting with trying to convince people to purchase big things, more difficult tasks, whether that is, installing a new Velux window or a big sofa, whatever that might be. Sometimes these bigger tasks can be too overwhelming to take on. And therefore, if you're a multi-product retailer, there's obviously the opportunity to start small, right? To start with something small that can trigger a chain reaction. And I think this is a huge opportunity for brands to think about how they retail and sell products. Corus and I were chatting the other day, in fact yesterday, about the sorts of projects that he's now able to take on. So previously, putting up a shelf might have been a bit of a struggle, but right now he's considering repaving his entire drive, which 6 months ago would have been a daunting challenge to take upon. But now, because his confidence has grown, it's allowed him to consider more complex tasks. And I think this is a really interesting idea of understanding your target consumer as well as a retailing strategy. If you're selling a single product or tools, for instance, consider at what point the consumer is on their journey in terms of level of confidence. But really what I'm talking about there is a confidence in terms of a system of design, of how they want to represent themselves to the world. And understanding where they are on that journey will allow us to merchandise, to retail, to build brands more strongly with them. So we want to look at some of the trends that are behind the motivations that are on the rise. I guess it's no surprise that we can easily say our homes become more important and during lockdown and probably post it. And the big trend here is around cocooning. So this was a huge trend pre-COVID, but it became, I guess, a real go-to that in times of trouble, we often retreat to safe havens. That's our kind of caveman brains kind of kicking in, where we want safety in the safety of four walls, and creating cocooning environments and comfort became a real kind of counter to the outside world. And when we spoke to consumers about this, I guess it was quite powerful, some of the thinking and the insights that started to come out of this. So comfort came out of chaos. It made me rediscover my own home, and I feel much closer to my house now. So I think this is the idea that if we think about a younger generation, probably were going out a lot. This is how they connected and built a personality, a cohesive design system to say who they were. And suddenly they were stuck in our homes, and they were feeling much closer to them, almost like that it was a person. It personified beyond just objects, and suddenly they were rediscovering them for the first time. I want to mention B&Q because their new "You Can Do It" campaign, I think, really taps into this more emotional state. Many of you will see it. It's a brilliant piece of work, I think. And they really tapped into this idea of an emotional encouragement. You don't buy a life, you build one. And I think this is a change that banks went through a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, when they would, let's say, be focusing on selling loans and and mortgages. It was all about, interest rates and APRs and all that sort of stuff, and a very functional sell. And then they realized what a loan meant. A loan meant, a wedding. A loan meant, an extension to someone's house, that meant they could have an extra child. The money meant something in terms of a bigger term. Life impact, and you can argue, if we start to think of our homes as exactly that, this concept really taps into it. The first kiss with the light switch, peace, the shed in the garden. They really started to understand that this wasn't just stuff that we're putting in our homes that had a function. It was creating opportunities in our lives that had a bigger emotional call. The other concept that we've seen, and again, I think this is really interesting from a personal perspective. I'm I guess an avid DIY fan, probably can be down my nearest DIY store probably twice, 3 times a weekend sometimes, as I've forgotten something and had to go back. And I guess during COVID, what I noticed, and this is just a small indication, but the sorts of people that were going into a DIY store had changed. Suddenly, there were people that I guess weren't your typical DIYers. These were people that would probably be seen more likely in the streets of, say, Shoreditch, hipsters, millennials, whatever you'd like to define them as. Suddenly, a new generation were defining that their homes had become important. And with this new younger generation, they started to do DIY. So 56 of 25 to 34-year-olds and 49% of under 24-year-olds say they've done DIY since COVID, and started to discover this. And the way that they're discovering how to do DIY and experience home brands is changing. So the internet has always been there for them. They've grown up for it, but that's almost their first point of call in terms of understanding how to do something, or if they get stuck, which creates a huge opportunity for brands to provide knowledge and education, as many of you will know. But what happened, and I guess it's to the same idea of a chain reaction, is they grew in confidence. And 68% of under 34-year-olds now feel more confidence in DIY since lockdown, which is a huge upswing. So to recap the first couple of bits, so we think there's a chain reaction that's been started, and the Diderot effect helps us kind of understand that. We've got a new, younger consumer, and we've been cocooning for a while. But I want to just go one stage deeper and just get to some of the more underlying behaviors and trends that are supporting this. And there's about 5 or 6 here that I think hopefully you'll all find quite interesting. So the first is homes on display. So I guess millennials previously, and apologies for talking about millennials, but it's a great catch-all term when I've got a number of kind of clients and brands on the call today to sort of talk about a huge swathe of consumers. But typically they wouldn't spend money on decorating a rented home. Why would they do that, But now they're spending money on plants, walls, shelves. And, the idea that they would, why would you want to spend money on someone else's home? And then suddenly they've discovered, actually, if they're not going out, it's better to spend money on their own home because that's enhancing their own experience. So you could easily argue we're moving to a model maybe similar to Germany. So in Germany, when people rent, they rent for a long-term period of time. So you'll rent for 20 years if you rent in Germany. House ownership is not as strong. Now, obviously, home ownership is a really important aspiration in the UK, but I think maybe we're taking a leaf or a kind of page out of their book in terms of, even if maybe I'm going to be there for a short amount of time, the amount of time I'm spending in my home has significantly increased, and therefore the amount of pleasure that I want to get out of it also needs to be reflective of that. And again, many of you will know this, but millennials care what other people think. This is why, we grew up with the social media, and projecting who we are to everyone else mattered. And suddenly our homes are now on display, and articles like how to look smart with a bookshelf behind you have become, interesting for consumers to start thinking about. And what I think COVID did was it made us more reliant on technology to connect. So This has put this sort of pressure on the home to be a kind of a backdrop to our Instagram lives. So typically you'd go to a beautiful bar or a coffee shop, and that would be your drop your stage, or if you understand that. And now our homes are our stages. That's where we need to project our lives. So what I would kind of argue is homes have become the humble brag. This is when you look around and you think, well, look, I need to make this look good, because it's on show. This is, I guess, a new form of house proud that was maybe true of the 60s and 70s. You know, every pillow had to be in the right place. We've almost got to return to that that kind of mindset, although I'd call it the humble brag for this generation. And we've moved from this idea of what I would call staged to real time. So staged was when I would take a static image and I'd put that online. But increasingly, we are creating videos, we're having Zoom calls. It's our whole homes are on display real time. And that means it can't just be one corner of our lives that looks great. It becomes their entire homes that have to reflect our personal identities. The second trend I'd like to introduce you to is DIY as self-expression. So what we would refer to as maker culture, this idea of projecting yourself and your identity, and DIY being a way to do that. So, DIY haircuts were one form of creativity, but actually the novelty that you can express yourself through DIY and creating your own creation, or assembling a number of pieces together and creating your own personal reflection of yourself is really important. I think famously IKEA many years ago was frustrated at all the IKEA hack blogs that had been put out there. And then they realized, well, actually, that's what people were doing. They wanted a form of, it wasn't just fitting into the individual space and they could make a different shaped shelf to do that. It was people's self-expression. And they actually really got behind, I believe, some of these online blogs that were offering hacks, and probably took some inspiration from them. And so I guess because we're in isolation, we're maybe freeing ourselves from some of those expectations that was once put upon us. And that's allowing us time, and I guess you could argue the courage to experiment. And brands, I guess it may be adjacent to DIY, would be something like Hobbycraft. They've seen a surge into things like their ideas hubs, which is all about, concepts and different ways to express yourself through creativity. And I would argue that the two worlds are sort of coming a lot closer together. Self-expression and creativity and DIY are now a lot closer together. The third trend is flexible spaces. I guess this is maybe a slightly obvious trend, but it warrants talking about, because I know it'll be important to many of the clients and brands on the call today. But obviously, many of us are working from home. Therefore, we've had to sort of carve out workspaces, gyms as well, or we're creating rooms that become reconfigurable. You know, the dining room table has become, home office / business lunch / kids homework / homeschooling. And suddenly it's got to do a lot more jobs than ever before. And, of course, it's no surprise that searches in things like small offices increased significantly during lockdown. But I think maybe the interesting one I'd like to kind of pull out is about storage. I guess storage could have been seen as highly functional pre-COVID. It was that cupboard you had, the stuff that you stuff things in. But because our homes are on show, actually storage has become a way of self-expression. How you organize things, how you create a system for yourself to organize your life is really important. And using some of our analytics is look, you have an uplift in consumer behavior over the next 6 months. 14% is what we're suggesting. And I think the other thing I'd like to say on the concept of people's homes becoming more multifunctional is Previously, home brands and DIY brands, I guess, exclusively talk to the home buyer mentality. But because our homes have become offices, you've got a swathe of new technology brands that are now entering the mix. So it's become slightly more competitive. So people will be buying business headphones, they'll be buying business desks. There's a number of other requirements. And I think that offers both opportunity if you're a business tech brand coming into the home, or if you're a consumer orientated brand, how do you respond to that? What's your offering? How do you understand the mentality of flexible working? And this idea that we need to create a multifunctional home environment. We're doing a lot of work for a large tech brand in this space at the moment, and it seems to be going very well, in fact. So DIY for self-care. Unfortunately, COVID has had a huge effect on our mental health. Many of you would have seen the social media post that happened recently, I'm not okay, with I think it was 30,000 people responded. It's probably shot up from when I've last seen the data. And there's no doubt that isolation, the effects of job losses and furlough has had an impact on society. When we look at some of our predictive analytics, and this is not an exact science, obviously, within mental health, we can see that that is due to increase. So people have, in the last 18 months, 93% increase in struggling. Depression's had a growth of 26% in the last 18 and 28% for anxiety. What does this mean for DIY? So I think this is a real opportunity to create pleasure of the creation of things. So there's a wonderful book. It's a bit of a complicated long read, but I do recommend it. It's called Flow, and it's the psychological kind of concept of optimal performance. And in real simple terms, it's the idea of if something's not too difficult and not too easy, it's the kind of perfect place to be. It's your happy place. If it's too easy, it's not exciting. If it's too difficult, it's frustrating. And I would argue that DIY has got this amazing opportunity to allow us to have pleasure. So the photo on the left, I guess, represents maybe how people felt of doing DIY before. It was stressful. It was, not a pleasant experience. But in the slightly cheesy photo above, you've got this concept of people working together, kind of somewhat enjoying it. I think we've all got that friend that loves putting flat pack furniture together, right? They actually take pleasure from completing that task. And this is backed up with a bit of science here. So this is a study published in the Public Journal of Occupational Therapy. And what they found is people that are knitters who had depression felt happier after knitting. So this concept of probably knitting be exactly in the concept of flow. They were probably taking on a concept that was not too difficult, not too easy. When they completed that task, it made them feel more positive. There's a famous woodworker, Sebastian Cox, and he talked about the idea, I get lost in the task of controlling the tool to cut the wood in a precise and accurate way. And I think this really is a great opportunity to think about how we think about DIY brands. I guess many present the idea of before and after, and the sort of memes as well that exist online, the kitchen makeover. But there's immense pleasure that can be taken from actually undertaking the task. The satisfaction can be in the doing, not just the end result. The fifth trend I'd like to introduce is clean homes. And this was a huge trend pre-COVID. So we've been busy cleaning our homes and becoming more interested in this concept, famous authors coming through, discussions on daytime TV. And this is a big shift. I think 20 years ago when social media was saying first coming out, we used to joke that, what would a cleaning brand write to be on social media? Who would follow? Who would be engaged in a social media, in a cleaning product? You look at brands like Dettol, they did a campaign during COVID in India that got something like 15 billion views, which is phenomenal, right? And they've got the data to back it up. And we don't see this trend as stopping anytime soon. So our predictive analytics suggests that it's going to grow about 11% in the next 6 months. And what is this cleaning? Why are we cleaning? The behavior behind it. So we think it's this opportunity to feel smart and savvy. And that's one of the reasons why cleaning hacks are so important. But to bring it into a bit more of an organizing thought, just thinking about good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You could argue back when pre-COVID, maybe say 10 years ago, cleaning was offered safety. It was a psychological kind of retreat that offered the basic needs. We'd suggest that cleaning now feels a more emotional state. So in the same way we talked about B&Q, thinking about creating a home, and a kiss, a light switch represents the first kiss. Actually, cleaning now is about self-actualization, self-esteem. So it's become really powerful in terms of how people are thinking about that. And that's not just to be clean, of course, it's just to project oneself, our ideals. The 6 is the last trend I'm going to introduce, and we've kind of whistled through this, which is fantastic, is homes as escapism. So this was some data that we picked up using our analytics tool. Does staying at home count as a staycation? And you can see here this person's kind of done up their home using various kind of retailers' products to create a moment of escapism. And when we look at staycation as an underlying trend, we expect this to grow 24% in the next 6 months. So people aren't going to be going abroad. They are going to be staying in the UK, and they're going to be staying predominantly at home, as well as visiting further afield. I love this image. I couldn't find who created it, so apologies if anyone does know who did it, but it was very clever. A Lonely Planet, The Office, Lonely Planet, the bathroom, and this concept that we'll be spending more time in our homes as a joke. But actually, if we look at the data, we can suggest that a lot of people will be using their homes as forms of escapism, and that escapism means that we're going to want to create memories from also to remember memories from the past, so things we've been, places we've gone, all of that sort of visual imagery that we want to evoke and bring into our homes. And the second will be things that we want to create in the future, places we would have otherwise gone, and how we can start to bring that almost sense of adventure. We might become more worldly in how we kind of think about our homes, how they represent an escape. So there was 6 trends today I've presented to you: homes on display, self-expression, flexible spaces, self-care, clean homes, and escapism. There's 3 big takeouts I want to leave you guys with today. Is significant life events drive trial. It can create a chain reaction. And being early into this conversation is really important. So many of our clients, they're thinking about how do they convince their bosses to spend money on advertising or paid social, or in-store. They think traffic is low, sales are down. I would argue being at the beginning of the conversation, the beginning of the chain reaction for when we return to growth is significant, and therefore growing market share is really important even in times of a drop. The second is we would always say just understand the emotional triggers that exist behind the trend. So dig a little bit deeper and understand what's the underlying consumer behavior. And the final one that hopefully we've set out, and I know many of you are thinking about, have we just seen a short-term sales spike because of furlough and people spent, their money from their mortgages on their homes? Is that going to continue? How can it possibly continue? We'd like to suggest that we've started a chain reaction, and consumers will continue to build in confidence as they take on more tasks, and they'll continue to want to have a system that can represent who they are. So that's it from today. So we've whistled through it. Maybe, Coris, should we open the floor to some questions? I don't know if any have come through, but
yeah, exactly. None have come through at the moment, but if you do have any, just remind us to stick that in the chat or either in the FAQ tab. I think I had a question which was, I think you just touched upon right at the end, you know, in terms of and it was shared. This kind of concern was shared with a number of people when they registered for the event. Just talking about the longevity of this trend. Obviously, we've seen an increase, a spike in revenue for a lot of these DIY and home care brands, and people have been moving to renovate their homes or get into DIY. But there was a concern about how long do we think this is going to go on for, particularly in light of the fact that, as you say, coming to the end. I know, like, first-hand personal friends, you know, who've taken the mortgage holidays and actually they ended up spending that money on DIY and looking into every part of the home just to kind of make it as nice as they can. Yeah. Those are coming to an end, as are other tax breaks. So the question is, you mentioned about it's the start of the trends. I don't know, maybe you could explore that a little more and just
yeah. So it's a great question. So here's the way that we think about it. So sales versus building brand awareness. So sales can go up and down, of course, and within that, you know, COVID has created peaks and troughs for some brands. Some have completely stopped. Some have done significantly well. Others have seen blips. So the question becomes, will that continue? Now, each category, each brand will differ. What we can propose is the idea that advertising has a long-term effect on consumer behavior. So a lot of brands pause their advertising when their sales go down. But that's actually not how advertising works. Advertising works by building long-term memory patterns in the consumer's mind. So the average advert, and this is from some research from the IPA, I'm remembering, it's that's fascinating, talks about the idea that the optimum brand recall for an ad can be up to 3 years. So it's over a number of years that a brand is transformed and grows its share of awareness. Awareness translates over the long term into sales. So the argument can be made to continually build market share even in times of trouble, because when a swing back up comes, you have a greater share of the consumer than your competitors, and therefore be on a better position. For anyone that wants some solid stats and some research around this, we've got about a 20-page deck that's really interesting, that could be slotted into any management meeting to help argue the case of why spending is critical, even if short-term sales have declined. So in the case of DIY, what we think will happen is there has been a boost, but because people are creating this chain reaction, some of the small things that we've undertaken will start to grow, and people will gradually take on larger and larger tasks, and their confidence will grow as well. There are clearly other factors at play, like interest rates and costs of loans and things, and market confidence that are outside of our control. But we're thinking, I guess, predominantly about things inside of our control.
Okay, I've got a question here from Alison Andrea. Do you think the shift will have changed the consumer journey for DIY?
I think so, right? If we look at maybe the concept of multi-channel. So I think it's really hard to argue that online is more important than offline. So a study done by Unilever actually found that e-commerce sales, so consumers that bought in online, actually went on to spend more in store. And because of how most brands track spend and consumer behavior, there's very, very little known for most brands about how the two affect each other, and whether one is helping the other, or whether it's just stealing share, and whether it is a kind of cannibalizing your own sales. I would suggest that, having seen the Unilever report from a few years ago in that obviously slightly different category, that multi-channel was obviously here to stay, but understanding attribution modeling and where your sales are coming from, it's really, really easy, because the data shows, because you can track everything online, many brands over-index on thinking that digital is the most important, because they apply a last click model. So I would always recommend really understanding kind of your attribution modeling. And as a rule of thumb, multi-channel is probably more important than just prioritizing one channel versus another. And obviously, if some consumers haven't been able to go into stores, but retailers are generally open now, maybe restricted, and the behaviour probably is different that when we're going into stores. Again, that would differ for different brands, but maybe browsing has reduced, and when people are going in, they're more serious purchases. So, previously, you might wander around a store for a bit of inspiration. I would probably argue people are wandering around the internet for a bit of inspiration, and therefore, when you're coming into store now, you probably mean business a bit more. You're ready to make a decision. You've made a more defined journey. In another sector, I can say that fashion brands, one of the behaviors that they've noticed is returns are down. So when people are buying things online, before COVID, they would just buy a load of stuff and it would turn up, and then they'd send a load of it back. They found actually a huge reduction in returns over the last couple of quarters. People have been more meaningful with their purchase habits. It's a more meaningful, considered purchase. And the upside for those retailers is a less return. So I think it's probably more considered, the purchase behavior. But equally, a lot of consumers are treating themselves. And therefore, I think the idea of spontaneous kind of treats to make us happy with small purchases, I think will continue. Again, different for different categories.
Cool. I got another question here, which I think might relate to what we covered before about the longevity of keeping consumers engaged, but it's let me read out. So the question says, our brands have a lot of products which have a 2 to 5 year cycle, restaining decks or painting houses. So we're expecting a huge slump next year because we have had 2 or more years worth of DIY done in 8 months. So we're trying to find strategies to last to the tricky 2021 that will follow this boom in sales years. So I guess that's a question of just like, people normally do things over a certain period of time. You've covered now about how the barrier to entry has been kind of lowered. YouTube has taught people how to get involved and start small, grow big. But the net result of that is they've actually, I can speak anecdotally for myself. During lockdown, there's nothing left to do to my house. So where do people move from that point of view? Will it result in a slump, or do brands need to kind of innovate and get creative to keep consumers engaged and inspired?
Yeah, great question. So I think the way I think about it is most brands have got marketing calendars that haven't changed for years. They generally stick with the idea of 80% is tried and tested, and maybe 20% is trying something new. I think depending on the category, you have to really review everything and decide whether your marketing your calendar plan is fit for purpose, and some of the old rules just don't apply anymore. So we're working with a trains client, and the old rules just don't apply anymore in terms of how people are commuting, how people want to travel. So I think you have to be bold with the actions, but first identify the behavior and size and scale that behavior to understand what should your future marketing campaign look like. The other thing I would suggest is, in terms of downturns and recessions, some of the biggest companies in the world were born out of massive changes. So, Microsoft came out of a recession, a number of other brands did. So I think there's an opportunity to innovate for in certain sectors with the right products that consumers will be more open to. And social media has given that a new kind of a life. Sharing something online about DIY has now become, I would argue, socially acceptable, even building your own status. So products that you've maybe even forgotten about that are sitting in a warehouse somewhere that previously no one was interested in, they might have been too gimmicky or not mainstream enough, maybe that might hold the keys to opening up new revenue streams. So a long, hard look in the mirror about who your consumer is, how habits have changed, and the implication being, if that means completely ripping up your marketing calendar for the year, sometimes that's the right decision to make.
Great. Okay, well, I don't believe there are any more questions. So maybe I think it's probably, it's coming up to 50 minutes of a good time to wrap up. So thanks to everyone who's joined the session. As I mentioned at the start, if what you've heard has resonated and you'd like to explore some of the themes a little further, then get in touch with myself, Coris, that's Coris at unearth.com. And we can have a chat about either setting up a follow-up session or a workshop just to explore certain themes or thinking further. So I think thanks very much, Chris, and we'll wrap it up there.
Pleasure, everyone. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. You will have a greater share of the consumer than your competitors, and therefore be on a bit better position. For anyone that wants some solid stats and some research around this, we've got about a 20-page deck that's really interesting, that could be slotted into any management meeting to help argue the case of why spending is critical, even if short-term sales have declined. So in the case of DIY, what we think will happen is there has been a boost, but because people are creating this chain reaction, some of the small things that we've undertaken will start to grow, and people will gradually take on larger and larger tasks, and their confidence will grow as well. There are clearly other factors at play, like interest rates and costs of loans and things, and market confidence that are outside of our control. But we're thinking, I guess, predominantly about things inside of our control.
Well, okay, I've got a question here from Alison Andrea. Do you think the shift will have changed the consumer journey for DIY?
I think so, right? If we look at maybe the concept of multi-channel. So I think it's really hard to argue that online is more important than offline. So a study done by Unilever actually found that e-commerce sales, so consumers that bought in online, actually went on to spend more in store. And because of how most brands track spend and consumer behavior, there's very, very little known for most brands about how the two affect each other, and whether one is helping the other, or whether it's just stealing share, and whether it is a kind of cannibalizing your own sales. I would suggest that having seen the Unilever report from a few years ago in that obviously slightly different category, that multi-channel was obviously here to stay, but understanding attribution modeling and where your sales are coming from, it's really, really easy, because the data shows, because you can track everything online, many brands over-index on thinking that digital is the most important because they apply a last click model. So I would always recommend really understanding kind of your attribution modeling. And as a rule of thumb, multi-channel is probably more important than just prioritizing one channel versus another. And obviously, if some consumers haven't been able to go into stores, but retailers are generally open now, maybe restricted, and the behavior probably is different that when we're going into stores. Again, that would differ for different brands, but maybe browsing has reduced, and when people are going in, they're more serious purchases. So previously, you might wander around a store for a bit of inspiration, I would probably argue people are wandering around the internet for a bit of inspiration. And therefore, when you're coming into store now, you probably mean business a bit more. You're ready to make a decision. You've made a more defined journey. In another sector, I can say that fashion brands, one of the behaviors that they've noticed is returns are down. So when people are buying things online, before COVID, they would just buy a load of stuff and then it would turn up and then they'd send a load of it back. They found actually a huge reduction in returns over the last couple of quarters. People have been more meaningful with their purchase habits. It's a more meaningful, considered purchase. And the upside for those retailers is a less return. So I think it's probably more considered, the purchase behavior. But equally, a lot of consumers are treating themselves. And therefore, I think the idea of spontaneous kind of treats to make us happy with small purchases, I think will continue. Again, different for different categories.
Cool. I got another question here, which I think might relate to covered before about the longevity of keeping consumers engaged, but it's let me read out. So the question says, our brands have a lot of products which have a 2 to 5 year cycle, restaining decks or painting houses. So we're expecting a huge slump next year because we have had 2 or more years worth of DIY done in 8 months. So we're trying to find strategies to last to the tricky 2021 that will follow this boom in sales years. So I guess that's a question of just like, people normally do things over a certain period of time. You've covered now about how the barrier to entry has been kind of lowered. YouTube has taught people how to get involved in start small, grow big, but the net result of that is they've actually, I can speak anecdotally for myself, during lockdown, there's nothing left to do to my house. So where do people move from that point of view? Will it result in a slump, or do brands need to kind of innovate and get creative to keep consumers engaged and inspired?
Yeah, great question. So I think the way I think about it is most brands have got marketing calendars that haven't changed for years. They generally stick with the idea of 80% is tried and tested, and maybe 20% is trying something new. I think depending on the category, you have to really review everything and decide whether your marketing your calendar plan is fit for purpose. And some of the old rules just don't apply anymore. So, we're working with a trains client, and the old rules just don't apply anymore in terms of how people are commuting, how people want to travel. So I think you have to be bold with the actions, but first identify the behavior and size and scale that behavior to understand what should your future marketing campaign look like. The other thing I would suggest is, in terms of downturns and recessions, some of the biggest companies in the world were born out of massive changes. So, Microsoft came out of a recession, a number of other brands did. So I think there's an opportunity to innovate in certain sectors with the right products that consumers will be more open to, and social media has given that a new kind of a life. Sharing something online about DIY has now become, I would argue, socially acceptable, even building your own status. So products that you've maybe even forgotten about, that are sitting in a warehouse somewhere that previously no one was interested in, they might have been too gimmicky or not mainstream enough, maybe that might hold the keys to opening up new revenue streams. So I'd a long, hard look in the mirror about who your consumer is, how habits have changed, and the implication being, if that means completely ripping up your marketing calendar for the year, sometimes that's the right decision to make.
Great. Okay, well, I don't believe there are any more questions. So maybe I think it's probably, it's coming up to 50 minutes of a good time to wrap up. So thanks to everyone who's joined the session. as I mentioned at the start, if what you've heard has resonated and you'd like to explore some of the themes a little further, then get in touch with myself, Coris, that's Coris at unearth.com, and we can have a chat about either setting up a follow-up session or a workshop just to explore certain themes or thinking further. So I think thanks very much, Chris, and we'll wrap it up there.
Pleasure, everyone. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.